Hello, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, and today we have another author making her official debut here on the channel. And what's also really cool, another California native. My guest holds a degree in classics with an emphasis in language and literature from UC Santa Barbara. She lives in California with her husband and son, and her debut fantasy novel, When Shadows Grow Tall, was published in August of this year with Roundfire Books, an imprint of Collective Ink. She has also written short fiction in Trollbreath Magazine, coming out December of this year, as well as Moonday Magazine for October of 2025. She is working on Writing What She Knows with a dystopian utopia satire based in a near future Southern California. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest and fellow Californian, Maressa Garner. Maressa, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriel. And I did not know that you were also in California.
Yes, I am also in Southern California, Orange to be specific.
Cool. Right on. I'm just up the coast in Santa Barbara.
Nice, nice. So before we go into your debut novel, is there anything else you would like to add about your background? Anything that wasn't mentioned in the bio?
No, I think that about covers it. Just for a basic understanding of who I am and where I'm coming from. I spent 10 years in business after school before I started writing, mostly full time. So that's another bit about me that I guess is of interest.
Nice. All right. And just as a little teaser for our viewers and listeners, what can you tell us about your debut novel that just came out a few months ago?
Yeah, so When Shadows Grow Tall is a literary fantasy. And I say literary because the language and the concepts are not necessarily commercial. There are some pretty heavy philosophical ideas, and the prose itself is has been described by others as lyrical, as lush, with a lot of poetic imagery. So I like to call it a literary fantasy for that reason, so that people know what they're getting into. And yeah, it's the first in a trilogy, as most good fantasy stories are. They take a long time to really flesh out the ideas that you're trying to explore. So, um, yeah, it is set in more or less like an analog Middle Ages, right around the time that the printing press was being not developed,
Ooh,
but
okay.
50 years more or less after the printing press has been unleashed onto the world. So while it's not our specific history, you can imagine that it's around that time. And yeah, we have a dual POV, um, following kind of the one normie, and then the the POV of the Dactyli, which is they're two men who are from this order of, you can think of them as druids, whose their sole purpose is to safeguard objective truth. Throughout time, they have gone about the land and gathered and collated these truths. So they sort of act like bastions of knowledge, and people have gone to them for millennia for answers. And their order is dying. People are turning elsewhere for their answers, their schemes, their solace. And yeah, so that's kind of where we land at the beginning of the story is Kylene, and her father is a printer.
All right.
And he is wanted for sedition because there's a totalitarian government in power. And so those are the two kind of setups that we have.
Fascinating. It does come almost along line with like the history of our own for the printing press, how when it first came out, a lot of people, especially in power, were a little hesitant of the dangers it would give them, especially allowing the lower class and the illiterate the opportunity to read and really change the power dynamics of the late Middle Ages and early pre-modern era. So that's actually very interesting, Maressa. So let's actually go into your background and learn a little bit more about how the story came about. So growing up, were you always a creative child, or did that come about later in life?
I'm not somebody who has been scribbling in a notebook since I was 12. That's often something that you'll hear of writers. I have always loved the written word. I used to write a mean email back in the day. But I've written poems, I've started little stories here and there, but I never really endeavored to write books, but I have been a voracious reader my whole life, and specifically of fantasy novels. So that's where it comes from, is just having so loved just the fixture of a book as a means of exploration or escape, loving the beauty of the written word and the power of the written word, and then always kind of wanting to do it, but never really going for it until somewhat recently.
All right. So what would you say was your aha moment when you realized you wanted to take a chance and create your own story? Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. Yeah, I'm a COVID author. I had a reasonably high-powered job working for a natural foods business, and in 2020, the food systems were really hit hard. Specifically, some of the bigger buyers were just cutting distributors, and I had to step away from my position. And it was during this time that I didn't want to look for another job right away. I was freelancing, consulting, and that was working. And my husband is the one that really encouraged me. He's like, I think that this is a really ripe opportunity for you to give this a shot. And so I did. And I didn't have the idea for a story kicking around so much as I had the two main male characters, who are the Dactyli, sort of
Okay.
existing and like talking in my head for about 2 years. And it was more like their inner voices that brought the story to life from the beginning. So that was it. I mean, I sort of tentatively dipped my toe in, and it was just a pretty transformative experience, stepping into the life of a world builder, and what that did to my headspace, like in the real world. I just really loved creating and having that be a part of my life, and I started just rapidly writing short stories, and I guess kind of that was it for me.
Awesome. So would you agree that the story that you had came about, but not in the traditional way where, some authors have had the story in their head for years, but rather you've had these two characters that have been really fascinating to you. And by writing these characters out, the story sort of came naturally. And that's how your debut novel sort of came into fruition.
For sure. There were some of the themes of the novel are also reflective of things I was tripping out about at the time, specifically truth. I think, consensus reality has always been a dicey topic, but, we really saw reality kind of come apart at the seams in like the 2020 election. And I just got really fascinated by this idea of truth. And there were so many truths being spit hither and yon by every kind of person. And, it just really led me to question, how do I decide what makes a thing true? Contextually, you change one variable and suddenly something that was true maybe no longer is. So, it was born from the characters, but it was also born out of me just watching what was going on, observing power dynamics, being really fascinated by what I was seeing, at large. And from there, the story really took shape from those two kind of firmaments.
Fascinating. So now let's actually dive more into the creation of your debut novel. So when you actually sat down and gathered all of the ideas to create your story. Did you have any goals, not just for yourself going forward with this story, but did you also think of, the goals or the promises that you wanted to make for your future readers, or did that come later towards the editing process?
Yeah, I think, novels can do lots of different things. And I wanted mine to have really relatable characters that can help you connect more deeply to yourself and other
Mm,
people. So there is an element of relativity in that respect. And I do want readers to, relate and also look through the eyes of other people, and perhaps glean new points of views. But more than anything, this is a novel of ideas. And I think that my biggest desire for a reader would be to really just interrogate their held beliefs, their perceptions, and consider that structures of freedom and power, notions of truth, are really mutable. And I'm not trying to lead the reader towards any one truth. But I do just want them to, interrogate, how they decide what makes a thing true for them, and just think more deeply about, systems of power and, good and bad, black and white, maybe not the best way to put our foot forward as we enter 2024, 2025, the future. And so I think that, yeah, just relating more deeply, thinking more deeply, those are things that I want the reader to do, as they read the book.
awesome. And actually reminds me of another book that I actually read, which almost had the same kind of themes, was the duology series by Stephen Arion, who wrote Warrior and Coward, where, we have this idea of, like, the hero's quest of, the hero coming back from a great journey. He's regarded as like this, savior. And there are so many troops saying, oh, he's the one that can save us. We know he'll save us because we have all these truths. But he subverts the expectations. He pretty much says, the author, well, through the character, says, I'm not a hero. I just got lucky. Everyone else on this quest died. I just so happened to have survived. And, everyone's writing all these stories about me, about what happened. It's like, that's not what exactly happened. He knows what happened. He knows the truth, but he can't outright say it because the truths that have been created, the songs and the ballads of his team, have, inspired the people and given them hope, even though, in his words, it's a fool's hope. So I like when, we can have these very, very complex discussions where it's woven, perfectly into the story, and it allows the reader to really think and really reflect on, not just the story, but also what is the story telling us. And I'm wondering, is that kind of along the lines of how your initial readers picked it up when you, I don't know if you did beta readers or ARC readers, or send it out to friends and family to read ahead before publication. But from the initial reaction that you did get, what was that reaction like? Was it positive? Was it negative? Or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, it was more on the positive side, but I think, what was really revealed to me in a lot of the feedback I received, I worked with NetGalley, so I had quite a few ARC readers, who were able to read the book pre-publication and offer reviews on Goodreads. It became so clear to me that everyone reads for different reasons, right? So for the people that were looking for like a fourth wing, spicy romance, fantasy situation, it did not please them.
Mm,
um, but, I think true lovers of the genre, folks who grew up on Tolkien, um, I think that I did satisfy, on one hand, like just the atmosphere and the lush world building and the slightly archaic prose. I was really diligent to not use words that were, in the dictionary before like 1650, for example. So I
okay.
was pretty rigorous with that, which I think some readers absolutely adored. And other readers, I think one person was like, it seems like she's just trying to use every big word she could come up with. So, but on the whole, the feedback was quite staggeringly positive. And I'm so pleased because I realized that, we're living in this age of instant gratification and ideas being unpacked in 5 seconds and adopted or discarded. So, it's a slower book. It's not like a lickety split pace.
Right.
And I think that, yeah, most people who, really grew up reading the epics, really, really liked it. And that was really gratifying to me because that is, who I wrote the books for, is adults who have loved this genre their whole life. Yeah.
Nice. And again, that statement reminds me of another guest I had on the show. I want to say last month. And, his story, or his goal for his story in particular, was trying to go back to the stories that he grew up with, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and all the classic fantasy and sometimes sci-fi books, or as you would say, like the epics of like the 20th century that were not so much about, the pop-ups that happen in the book, like, oh, jump scares, or like, oh, big reveal, or, the tropes that we see nowadays in the 21st century. So I'm kind of getting the sense that it's almost like a return and an homage to classic storytelling. And that, of course, leads to the next question, which I think you may have already answered, but maybe you can also go in detail. From those initial reactions and sort of like the response and feedback you're getting, would you say it, in a way, it validated your goals going forward, not just with the first book, but also book 2 and 3 in the future?
Yes, for sure. I think you're right about kind of trope leading literature. Really, kind of, it's the day. They're having a moment right now, and it's hard. It was hard to sell this novel. Well, it was hard to get an agent for this novel. It wasn't hard to sell it to a publishing company, ironically. But yeah, I think there was enough like resonance, I think, between readers and myself, that I do feel really encouraged to go on. And it was a little disheartening, I think, with some of the negative reviews, just to realize that, there's so much richness that can be gained by immersing yourself in a fantasy world, and so much, mental exercises that can be done that goes, beyond just the emotional body and the immediate experience of love and heartbreak. You can explore so many different, systems of power and societal structures. So I've always loved that about fantasy, is just how intricate and, how well thought out all of the metaphor is that relates to our world. So yeah, does that answer your question? I sort of rambled on with that one.
Oh, no, that actually answered it perfectly. And what you said in the beginning actually now leads to the next reflective question, which I'm here to hear your thoughts on. So, as I'm sure you would definitely agree, writing a book is not easy. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It's a process. It's a job to just get the story outline, to the point where you like it. And of course, outlines do change, but it definitely gives you a rough guide to follow. And then, of course, it's hours and hours of writing, followed by possibly hours and hours, if not years, revising and editing. Then after that, it's getting professionally edited for publication, finding a cover artist, getting the ISBNs, formatting the book exactly the way you want it. And no matter what route you go to, whether it's independent, traditional, or hybrid, it all leads to the same goal, which is publication. And especially now in the digital age, I've talked with a lot of authors on the show that it's almost like a double-edged sword. Yes, with the digital age, you can reach a much wider audience. And that is good, especially for first-time authors. But on the other side of the coin, there is that sense of anxiety, the buildup, and if it's going to be received or not. And of course, the big one, the catalyst, which is imposter syndrome, which can completely derail an author and really make them feel like a deer in a headlight situation. And it's brutal. It can really shatter an author's drive to continue to write. So, Maressa, in your opinion, have you ever had those experiences of either imposter syndrome or anxiety? And if so or not, what has disciplined you to not just write this book, but also plan ahead to make a trilogy?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think there was a couple different tactics I took not knowing whether or not they would work. So one thing was setting aside the current project and working on short stories. That just really allowed me to keep honing the mechanism, and not just totally spinning my wheels in a rut with a story if I'm feeling, what am I doing? And, so much of writing is toiling in obscurity. And I
Right.
think one of the biggest hardships for me was having come from the business world where my emails were popping off. I had accountability. I had people reporting to me. And all of a sudden I'm just creating, like, for what, in a vacuum.
Right.
And that was a major, major head fuck, excuse my language.
You're good.
So yeah, I think so going to the short stories in times of mental strife was really helpful. And then honestly, writers, we eat rejection for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yes.
I think that you just have to eat it. You have to eat it so much until you realize that you like it enough to not have the outcome be that other people read your work. And I know that that is a really tough thing to do, and it's very ego driven. And I, of course, still want to be published and I want people to read my work. But I think if I hadn't decided that I loved the act of it enough, I probably wouldn't have made it to this point. So it was persistence, it was diversity. And, I think it helped to sell some short stories, it helped to have that validation. So I think the more that you can engage yourself in opportunities where your work can be seen and valued by other people, whether it's selling a short story, whether it's doing a Twitter pitch event and having
Yes.
a bunch of people really love your pitch. I think the more that you can get validation from your peers, even if it's fleeting, I do think that those things can also help.
Definitely, 100%. And I'm now excited to talk with you about the business side of being an author, because I've said in a previous interview that the business portion has now become my favorite segment to talk with my viewers and listeners, because I love hearing their thoughts on these questions in the publishing world. So the first question is almost like a little icebreaker. So from your bio, it seems that you went with a publishing house to publish When Shadows Grow Tall. Would that be fair to say?
That's correct. Yeah. So Collective Inc. is technically a hybrid publisher.
Okay.
They offer 4 different tiers, the latter 2 of which you do have to pay a nominal fee for. And then the 2 tiers, tiers 1 and 2, you do not. It's a traditional publishing deal. So I was fortunate to be offered a traditional contract with Collective Inc. So I had a very straightforward experience with the publishing house in the sense that the work went to a developmental editor and then a copy editor. With I don't think they have an in-house graphic designer, but they the the cover was made with my sort of artistic guidance. And yeah, I think the trade-off, with any small house is there's just never going to be the marketing dollars that one of the big 5 publishers have. So the onus of the marketing has 99.9% fallen to me. And that's just kind of the name of the game with small houses and in particular hybrid houses today.
Definitely. I'm also here to hear, as a little tangent question, but one I feel is important, is, sort of like this, how do I best say it? So, okay. So, as I mentioned before, I had one guest on the show who talked about his story being almost like an homage and respect to the classic epic stories. He was also a hybrid author, and he told me from his own experiences, there seems to be this disconnect between, hybrid authors and indie authors. In his opinion, he stated that, hybrid authors are kind of like in the middle. They're not fully traditional, but they're not fully independent. And, of course, with hybrid publishing, it kind of leads into the route of vanity publishing, in the sense that vanity publishers give off the appearance of legitimate hybrid publishers. And that can also, again, be a turn off for authors looking for their ways to publish their work. So ultimately what I'm trying to say is, when you were researching what route would be best for you, did you sort of come across this, discussion of, hybrid authors kind of being seen as, not really the best choice, and only that, indie or traditional are like the two quote unquote legitimate routes to go for publication?
Yeah, I have a pretty unique to me response to that. I didn't want, I wouldn't have accepted the offer if I had to pay for it, because I would have then self-identified as someone who went with vanity publishing, which is okay if that is you, but I really needed some entity
Right.
to have the confidence in the work to be able to sell it. And I think a lot of people, they say never publish your first book. A lot of people just trunk their first 6 books. I really needed to put a bow on it to keep going. And so,
Right.
one of the, not regrets, one of the bummer things is, I did have some manuscripts out with some more really reputable smaller houses. Bayan among them reached out to me like 6 months after I'd signed the contract. And I was like, I can't, it's signed. But for me, I think I just needed to get the book out there, and I wanted it to be semi-legitimate. And I didn't think too much about how it would be perceived by the masses. I think I just, yeah.
All right, that's actually a fair response. And what? Completely true. Ultimately, it's your decision. What decision is going to make you feel not only the most happy, but one, that this is the best path for me going forward. And of course, things can change as time goes on. You may want to go either independent, or may write another book, but have it go to a different house. That comes with time and just, honing your craft. And speaking of honing one's craft, this now leads into the next question, which is knowing your audience, because the audience is very, very important in the writing process. Now, initially for us authors, we are the first target audience because we know the story better than anyone else, and we're passionate about the story. When it comes to publishing it, we really have to consider, okay, what genre does this book actually fit in? And that, of course, comes to, if it's fantasy, it's going to usually have these elements of fantasy, or if it's sci-fi, it's going to have these elements. Or sometimes it's a mix of genres, as we see in books nowadays. They're like a mixture of like dystopian dark fantasy or thriller sci-fi, all of these different genres with their own niches for audience. And it can be overwhelming for authors to really think, who exactly am I writing for? So Marissa, when you began the process of now marketing your book, did you have a good idea of who your audience is? And in your opinion, how important is it to consider the audience, and when should authors consider the audience?
I don't know if I know the answer to when the authors should consider the audience, because I think that if you're going to be inspired enough by an idea, it's got to speak to you first and foremost in order for you to finish the thing.
Right.
So, it probably comes in the middle. I think that I was conscious of, more, it's not that recently, but more recently than like Tolkien, for example, Patrick Rothfuss and His Name of the Wind. That book and the style of that book, wildly popular, very whimsical, very, very beautiful lyrical prose writer.
Right.
And so I think I saw that and the lovers of people who loved, a slightly slower, it's not slow, but it's a little bit slower. It's very pastoral.
Mm.
I saw readers of that book as being kind of like my target audience. So it
Right.
was kind of based off of a comp, but everybody loved that book.
All right.
So yeah, I think that I thought of, and not even just people who traditionally love epic fantasy. One book that is probably in the top 10 for me in the last decade is Circe by Madeline Miller.
Right.
Not, it's a Greek myth retelling. So fantasy, sure, I guess it could fall under that heading, but just her evocation of place and the way that she's able to write an atmosphere, and again, with that lush prose, that was, I'm hoping to kind of capture people who are so taken in, by the style of the written word that it doesn't really matter what you're writing about. So I was kind of just trying to straddle that line.
All right. And kind of adding on to that, in your background of classics, when would you say that that has, come about the most helpful in not just, the writing process, but also in the marketing process, in terms of like, how are these classic books, marketed, or how are they presented to prospective readers?
So sorry, I'm not, it just makes, I want to make sure I understand your question. How are classical books marketed to prospective readers?
Yes, yes. So going back to like your background being in classics and your book falling under what you said is like literary fiction, where it's different from commercial fiction, have you noticed that there's a difference in how they're both marketed?
For sure. Yeah. And I think if I had to do it over again, I would probably change the blurb, because my blurb does read pretty commercial. And I think too, I didn't have a lot of training or foresight going into marketing the book. It just sort of dove in head first.
Mm.
And I'm excited to have an opportunity to do it again. Because that's really how I see this first book. It's a stepping stone, the direction that it's going is that's the question. It's not anything other than that. So yeah, I think that it can and should be marketed differently. I chose cover art that I felt was more literary, but I think some people have found quite boring.
Mm.
It's a wood etching that is done by an artist in Suffolk, and it's a facsimile of it, and then just with the color filter. So when you really look at it in detail, it's quite intricate and beautiful. But on its face, it's just a. I think I've got it here. On its face, it's quite plain, but you really have to peer, more deeply to
Oh, I can
see
see it. Yeah.
what's happening, and that's kind of like how my style of writing is too. So, yeah, the more I can learn to communicate that, this isn't I don't know how many times I've had to say it. This is a fourth wing, which I think so many, right? I love that there are so many new readers to the genre, but this expectation, that every fantasy is romantasy, has been a hindrance for sure.
Yes, I'm actually glad you brought that up. And no shade to romancy writers or books,
No, it's great.
but as Maressa said, the fantasy genre has been kind of dominated by the romance fantasy genre, and it's good that it's bringing in new readers, but everyone's now assuming that the fantasy genre is solely romance fantasy, and that's kind of where it's not really true. I mean, yes, it's a subgenre, but now it's sort of like taken over as like the main genre within fantasy. And that sort of leads into the discussion of, okay, when writing your own book, you want to show your individuality, but you also want to make it very familiar to fans of the genre, even if it's not romance fantasy, but another element of fantasy, whether it's literary fantasy, high epic fantasy, dark fantasy, or not even just fantasy in general. It could be other genres as well. So for you, Maressa, when you wrote this book, how did you sort of balance the two, where you wanted to show your individuality, but you also wanted to pay homage and respect to the classic epics of the past?
Yeah, I think for me, it was the harder work of it was, finding that individuality, because having no formal training in writing, what I was doing, the process was really just not regurgitating, but it was recursive in the sense that I was writing, what I knew, which is very classic hero's journey, and my task was really to breathe, fresh life into some really classic takes, specifically within the fantasy genre. So I was really quite pleased and felt it was innovative to really kind of delve into the philosophy of truth aspects. And that felt, freedom, good and evil, those are really classic
Right.
things. So it felt like a really timely and modern, I mean, certainly the philosophy of truth isn't a modern body, but to explore it, with our modern times in mind, that felt good to claim that as something that I had brought to the genre. And
Nice. And I like what you were talking about, the hero's journey, which is like the cornerstone to all stories. That the hero goes on a quest, we have the rising action leading to the climax, and then the falling action, and then this nice little circle. And a lot of people I've talked on the show have said, readers have believed that the hero's journey is kind of, overrated and oversaturated. But if you can tweak the hero's journey just enough, then you're able to play with it and make it fresh and exciting. Going back to Stephen Aaron's The Coward and the Warrior, that's what it does. It subverts the hero's journey, throws it on its head, and we are now seeing a character that pretty much, he doesn't want to be a hero. He wants to be left alone. He's pretty much given no choice. And it's like, all right, fine, I'll go on the quest again. And we see the trauma and the torment, the PTSD that this character has gone through, who, I should have said before, he was 7 years old. He was a young boy, and he's now in his 20s or 30s. So the PTSD that he experienced as a kid on this hero's journey and being dubbed the hero of his world, it's all a lie and it's all made up. And I really like how it is that homage like the classic epics, in the sense of this grand story with these impressive quests where it's really life or death. But it's very new, that it's a fresh take. And speaking of, freshness and being open to new readers, where would you say that your book falls under? And the reason I'm bringing this up is that, everyone wants to write to their audience, but in that audience, what exactly is the age bracket? Because I'm sure you would definitely agree, Marissa, that there are certain books that are targeted for either adults or new adults, but upon further reading, or let me rephrase it, targeted for young adults, but upon reading them, it's more adult and new adult. So it's kind of like that balance between, writing for a particular readership. So where would you say your book falls under on this sort of like age bracket for readers?
Yeah, I think it's so funny because so often in the early days when people asked, what I was doing with my time, I would tell them I was writing a fantasy novel, and the assumption was almost always like, oh, great, so it's a young adult novel, because that's what young adults read, right? People that don't know, we forget in our little corner of the world that not everybody reads fantasy, and realizes that it's an incredibly robust genre with many, many, many
Yes.
adult readers. So I set out to write the book for adults. I knew that the writing itself was going to be, complex structurally, but also that I wanted to explore these ideas that for sure aren't above, a 12-year-old, but I knew that I was going to be writing about them in a way that might be above a 12-year-old, if that makes sense. It's not that substantively they shouldn't approach. It's just that the mechanism of approach might be tricky. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to be as extra as possible my first time around. So I think 16 and up is sort of what I've been telling people. I mean, my 16-year-old niece read it and she loved it and she got it. So, and there's also, there's a near miss on a sexual assault. There's some brutality involved. So it's from like a pure, trigger warning.
Right.
Those things might not be best suited for under 16-year-olds.
Right. That takes also, time in honing the craft, because it also goes back to, the prose and language of how the story is written. Because again, there are certain books which are marketed towards one audience or one age bracket, but the language and the prose may be either too complex for the reader to understand, or the readers are going to get lost and confused. And at the end of the day, we don't want that. We want the readers to, read the book all the way through. Even if they don't like it, they at least understand what the intent was. Because I think you would definitely agree, Marissa, the worst thing that could ever happen to an author is when a person reads your book, they either A, don't understand it, B, they just stop reading it, or C, it's mix of A and B.
Yeah, I would agree. I did have one negative review that started with, I just couldn't wrap my head around this. And I was like, well, that's too bad.
Yes, definitely. And with everything we talked about so far, this now leads into probably the biggest reflective question here on the channel. It's probably one of my favorite questions to ask my authors. And I think you've touched on it before, Marissa, in previous questions. So I'm going to lay some context for this question. So when I first started this interviewing process 2 years ago, it was right around COVID. Actually, before COVID, it was mainly just my friends and people I knew in like a forum, indie authors. But as time went on, branched out, met other people, and then 2 years going forward, I was able to meet a lot of more authors on Instagram, as well as meeting authors in person and learning from them, hearing about their experiences, and just meeting a vast array of incredible people, all at different journeys of their life, at different backgrounds. I've kind of come to this realization that for authors, regardless of which of the three publishing routes you choose, ultimately they fall under the two paths, as I like to call it, to be an author and to be known as an author. And for me, to be an author is an individual dedicated to the art of storytelling, honing the craft, and not really motivated by capital, but it's nice to earn a little something here and there. The other one, to be known as an author, is an individual dedicated to marketing, social media, getting the word out there about their book, and ultimately being known as either a New York Times bestseller or a Pulitzer Prize winner. Now, both journeys have their own trials and hurdles, but I definitely feel, especially for first-time authors who have written their first book and really want to, get their name out there, the second path to be known as an author is the most tempting, but it definitely leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations, and ultimately the passion is going to die out. And the harsh truth is, in this industry, there's no guarantee your first book is going to give you the status and the gratification that you're looking for. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. There are authors whose first book did give them that status. And that's no easy feat. That is a huge accomplishment in of itself. But generally speaking, you have almost like this roller coaster where you hit some highs and lows. And ultimately, your passion is going to die. You're no longer motivated to hone your craft in terms of writing, but you're motivated by, what the more popular tropes, what, the popular thing that's happening, let's say for Fourth Wing, in terms of either like it's spicy romance fantasy or certain character tropes, anything. And you're just trying to hit the gravy train, which a lot of authors and publishers will agree that is the nail in the coffin for first-time authors, because you're not going to get those tropes. You have to think ahead. So ultimately, Marissa, here is my question to you. So what are your thoughts on this discussion that, yes, in this industry, there's no guarantee your first novel is going to give you the status or the gratification you are looking for, but it shouldn't deter you from honing your craft if you're truly passionate and dedicated to being a good storyteller?
Yeah, I agree 100% that it shouldn't be a deterrent. I think that it is a deterrent. And I think I just participated in a Twitter pitch event yesterday, Quest Pit.
Ooh.
And I found myself, I am just so frustrated by the mood boards and the agent, all of this little ticky-tacky marketing stuff that is, I think that they really like to see it, the agents. And I am just like, why would I want to pitch a book based on its tropes? Like, that's just so flattening and reductive and boring. So I think, sorry, that's a little bit tangential, but you did mention, writing for trends and trope forward work. And I think you've got to write, what's really singing in your heart, if I'm going to be super cheesy, but I think you've got to do that. And then if you keep doing that, your craft is going to keep getting better. And eventually your writing will be good enough to where it doesn't matter if it's a trend or not. Someone's going to crack that first page and read it. And they're going to be like, damn, I don't even know what this is about, but I don't want to stop. So there is this, I really don't believe in writing for trends. I really don't believe in writing books that are, I don't know, like guaranteed to be appealing to the widest
right
quotient of people. So I think, like I said earlier, about just, realizing that you really love it for the sake of it. I think that that's true. And I think that you've also got to keep stretching yourself to try other things as well. I started writing fantasy because that's what I knew best. And that's what was easiest for me to sort of emulate. But, I branched out. I started writing sci-fi, slipstream. My current books that I just finished the first draft of is, it's speculative, near future, dystopian, to just give it a few umbrella spokes. Yeah, so I think you've got to push yourself to, create greater range, but I don't think that range should extend to, just popular opinion.
Definitely. And I completely forgot. And actually, I'm glad you actually brought up, short stories. And I completely forgot that you've also written short stories for 2 magazines. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that and what we can expect when those issues come out.
Yeah, I'm really excited about those and just short stories in general. So the one that comes out in December in Trollbreath Magazine, it's 5,500 words, so a little bit on the longer end. I think 14,000 is when you hit novella, so it's not quite the longest it could be, but it's certainly not flash fiction. So I started writing that in the early days of when I was postpartum with my first and only child. And I just needed something to do. I was caring for this child 100% of the time. I was waiting for my copy edits to come in from my editor. And I was having a lot of feelings and experiences as a new mom. So I really, I subverted a lot of those feelings and a lot of angst I was having to just this far future sci-fi story about these women called the Bound, who are essentially like in thrall to the dominion of Deucalion. It's just the totalitarian regime of the day, and their whole thing is just to rear babies. Following a very explicit set of instructions. So it's called the instructions are explicit, and it's about one mom's kind of quest to break the bondage of, the regime, all of the things she's told she has to do for an optimal outcome. And so that'll be out. It's a little dark. It's definitely weird. But I really like reading it now, 2 years later, because I wrote it 2 years ago. But yeah, and then the other one in Moonday Magazine, it's very, very strange. It's about it's told in second person from the perspective of a shaggy mane mushroom. And
Ooh, okay.
so not from the perspective. So it's addressing you, the reader, as if you are the shaggy mane mushroom. And so I started working on this series of anthropomorphized tales of various species called It's What You Come to Expect. And it's basically just life, intent, birth, intent, and death. And so they're just these really short, it's flash fiction, it's 800 words, and it's the respective life cycle of an anthropomorphized shaggy mane mushroom. It's funny, it's quirky, it's biologically accurate. It's fun.
Awesome. Those are actually really, really cool. But also, it shows, the versatility of authors that, we're not just solely, pigeonholed to either writing novels or for in one genre, but we're able to broaden our horizon, not be pigeonholed. Because I definitely feel, whenever we're being compared to, especially nowadays in social media, whenever you get compared to other authors, it's nice, but that also kind of pigeonholes us into a box saying, oh, great fantasy writer, great thriller writer, great nonfiction writer. But it's like, well, thank you for the compliment, but I can write other stuff. I'm not solely a so-and-so author. Now, there are authors who may genuinely want to write in one genre, but it definitely doesn't hurt to broaden your horizon. And as I keep saying before, grit transforms into talent. And going back to what we were talking about just now about, your first book, and in this industry, it's a 50-50 chance. That is okay, because you know what? It may be your 7th book, maybe your 10th book, maybe your 20th book that gets your name out there and really, really showcases your work. And when that happens, it could be like, hey, thank you for checking out my book. And if you want to see my other ones and my growth, check out all of these down here. And you know what? That ultimately, at the end of the day, doesn't matter if you have like 100 readers or maybe just a small group of loyal readers have been by your side. At the end of the day, if you have one person reading your book, you are an author no matter what. And before we end this interview, I have two final questions that I'm going to combine together. So here's the first one, Marissa. So looking back on your journey thus far, are there any authors that you would like to give a shout out to who have helped you understand the industry a little bit better and have helped you hone your authorial voice with your book? And also, with everything that we've talked about, with everything you've said on these topics, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors who want to get a head start in the industry, or they are just deciding to grab a pen and a pad and begin writing?
Yeah, shout outs. I don't have one author who I like really deify. I have a whole pantheon. And for this book specifically, I think I really looked to Patrick Rothfuss and Scott Lynch for, fabricating just these really immersive, really tactile atmospheres and environments, which is something that I really, really wanted to do. I really wanted it to be multisensory all the time. I really admire Diana Gabaldon, the author of Outlander.
Ooh, all right.
Yeah, her ability, just her ability to immerse you in space and time, and the accuracy and authenticity that she gives to her work is incredible, and has probably been the longest standing inspiration of the three I've mentioned. And then broadly, not pertaining to this book, but just in life, Joan Didion, A.S. Biot, Kurt Vonnegut have been wildly influential on just the rendering of ideas into text. And yeah, I think the last two I would shout out, Alex E. Haro and Madeline Miller. Just lush, lyrical, gorgeous prose. You just want to eat it with a spoon.
Awesome. And finally, with everything that we talked about and everything you've learned on your own, as well as interacting with the authors you have just mentioned, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors wanting to begin in this industry?
Wisdom. I want to say just keep going. I want to say it helps to have a diverse outlets for the craft. It's not just writing, right? Like, it's reading poetry, it's having a writing cohort, it's beta reading for your friends, it's immersing yourself in story, multiform. So I think the more that you can do that, the more accelerated your craft will grow. And I think just the more you're not going to burn out and wonder what the hell you're doing. So yeah, just keep going. Try to find story in all the things. And yeah, that's what I got.
Perfect. 100% agreed. And with that, viewers and listeners, we have come to the official end of this amazing author interview here on the channel for the month of November. I want to give a huge thank you to Maressa Garner for coming on the show and telling us all about her journey and her book, as well as her short stories in the upcoming magazines, one for December of this year and one for October of next year. Maressa, thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can people find and engage with you on social media if they want to say hi or talk to you or ask about, any other questions?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for this opportunity. This was really fun and challenging at times, to talk about yourself and your work, but I appreciate the opportunity. You can find me, I'm mostly on Instagram, Maressa Kate, MaressaKate. I'm on Twitter. I can't call it X. Same handle with an underscore between Maressa and Kate. I can send you these so you can pop them in the caption maybe. And then I'm also on Blue Sky, and I do plan to use Blue Sky more consistently. And lastly, I have a website with a blog that may or may not convert to a Substack. I am just feeling insecure about contributing to the immense hordes of Substackers that already exist. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. And where can people find your book to purchase a copy?
The book is, wherever books are sold is kind of true. It's on Amazon, Amazon UK, Amazon US, Amazon France, Germany, Canada. My local bookseller will send you my Chaucer's, shout out Chaucer's in Santa Barbara. They'll send you a signed copy if you order it directly through them. Bookshop.org would be my preference. Their distribution model directly supports independent bookstores. So bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble. Yeah, Google it. It's on eBay. There's used copies on eBay. Like it's findable.
All right, I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Again, a huge thank you to our guest for coming out here and telling us all about her journey and her book and what we can expect from her in the future. And as always, my viewers and listeners, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you all in the next episode. And have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, wherever you are in the world.